morning, everybody. How are you? So, yeah, I won't answer any questions about things in the news. No comment. Don't know anything anyway. But just to give you guys a sense of what I wanted to talk about today is I think it's always interesting to kind of go through a story. We can sit up here and I can give you slides and statistics about what we do, but you know, my team at Cylance wakes up every morning and deals with you know, major attacks around the world, nation state. We deal with small attacks, large ones, attacks that don't turn out to be attacks, that turn out to be operational challenges. And you know, in each one of them, there's sort of a thread of similarity, especially when we talk about cyber attacks and breaches. And then there's a unique situation every time. So every company that's had this, even if it's the same attack that we're dealing with, has a different scenario. So I think about two months or so ago, I was waking up around 2 or 3 in the morning, and I saw a text from one of my leads. I won't say where. We don't say when, where, how, or who ever when we talk about these. And I noticed that this was a company that I had worked with, and I had known some of the players there, some of the execs. Was a little surprised by what I saw, you know, knowing some of the people that were involved. And the CEO, I guess, that morning got a text message, something like this. This was kind of the exchange. So it shows up, you know, wakes up. It's a 6:40. The timelines, I think, are important here too, and they're kind of relevant. 6:45 a.m. We kind of call this day one. You know, we're not sure. The CEO comes back and says, "Well, what is this? Is it bad?" You know, and so if you're the guy on the other side of it, is it bad? Well, yeah, of course it's bad. I'm texting you. You're the CEO. It's 6:45 in the morning, right? But you say something nice. Give me 30 minutes, and I'll get back to you. But it seems like it's very bad. This is a real scenario, by the way. We have lots of them. I kind of picked one out to talk about because it was fairly recent, and for me, it was there was a new experience in this one that I had. So, you know, the director of IT then generally, in this case, it's a pretty large company. So the CIO had a director of IT. The director of IT and his team were dealing, you know, head on with the systems at this point. Realizes that, you know, not only does he have one of the more recent sort of strains, in this case it was Paymer with a few other components in there that we've seen over the years. It was literally spreading from host to host. Now, when you think about it, a lot of times these organizations will have a problem because, you know, they haven't kept things patched. They don't have, you know, good security controls in place. We see that all the time. In this case, though, like I said, I was kind of surprised because I knew that the guys did a pretty good job and had actually been through 1 or 2 breaches in the past. And we had worked with them on them. So I got on the phone and I called my lead and I kind of asked him, well, you know, what's going on out there? And he said, oh, well, you know, they're running X, Y, Z. They weren't using our product, but I'm not going to even say that that's a factor because there's a lot of times when, you know, it's not a technical reason, it's a administrative or operational reason that a breach happens. What we found out was that pretty quickly that, you know, the situation was critical enough for them to disconnect everything. Now, what happened in this case was they actually had somebody, you know, from in the system. So a lot of times you'll have APTs, right, and it's not necessarily somebody, a live threat actor involved. You've got malware, it's sort of spreading. In this case, someone was in the system. They had their vendor working with them already for a day or so. The vendor was, you know, continually pushing out updates, signatures, and little heuristic changes. And unfortunately, because the attacker was watching pretty much everything they were doing on email with the vendor, was just literally morphing and changing the malware on an hourly basis. So it continued to spread. So, you know, sort of the next thing that happens then is sales gets involved, right? Sales is always involved because sales is the engine that makes companies run generally. Unless we're, you know, in the public sector and then it's sort of service. But in this case, you know, sales gets the call pretty early from and they tend to, in a in an enterprise have a lot of power and weight in the organization. The sales team wants to know, hey, I'm getting calls from customers. We're supposed to start projects. We don't know what's going on. Clients want to know, what's going to happen this week, but systems are down, so we've now been disconnected. Nobody can really see any of the updates. This particular customer, about 20,000 plus employees globally, was fairly automated in their operations and relied quite a bit on systems and orchestration and workflow apps to keep things going. Also had a lot of deep integration with partners, which is another thing that's sort of scary too when those partners are your customers. What happened, and you start thinking about dollars, and I'll get into some in a second. In this case, some deadlines got missed. So anybody that's in the proposal business, that could be, a deal that meant your quarter that year, and you were right at the end of it, and people working around the globe couldn't get it done. So, and then the next thing is, you kind of go to day 2, right? 6 a.m. next day, sales has been upset for a day. They generally, I heard somebody talk about attorneys, they're the same way. If they're offline for 5 or 10 minutes, then you get a lot of pressure real fast. And sales can do the same thing in an org. And then in this case, the company was still disconnected from their servers. The vendors now are starting to think about, how do we get in and help? So your trusted incident response vendors, not just anymore your software vendor, but now your consulting firms, your legal firms. A lot of people have been engaged in this point. And so we came in around this time. And it's interesting because when you're working through this, it's slow going, and it's very frustrating a lot of times because there's not really a silver bullet once you're in the middle of an incident and once systems are offline. And there's all kinds of sort of realities that start to take hold. So I always like to kind of give one really interesting one was that many of the company was actually, as I said, they were pretty advanced in what they did. They were using a password vaulting system that sort of kept everything off of individual hosts and endpoints. And anytime you would, reconnect a system, it would literally get infected in this case. So you also couldn't log in locally as administrator because the password vaulting system was only accessible through the network. So you started having these catch-22s that weren't even imagined, in the architecture design of the platform. So something that was meant to keep the system safe actually made it very, very difficult to recover individual systems. And the company would not plug a system into the network at that point because good chance that whatever system got plugged in was going to get ransomware on it. If we kind of take a look too, I think that if you think about incident response plans, this company had one. We had actually helped them at one time, a couple years back, working on some of the design of the plan. They kind of took it on their own. And one of the things that they didn't do, which and I'll talk a little bit about at the end, I think some of the learnings from this that they had, is that, the other departments outside, IT sort of owned that IR plan and security. So there was an ownership at the executive level, a deep ownership of the IR plan. There wasn't ownership at the business level because they hadn't been through this kind of situation where they had an outage. Day 2, right now, sales and operations are getting together. Screw these IT guys. We have business to do. We're going to start to figure out how to do things without the systems. We're going to go after the high-profile customers. And now you've got people that have been up for some cases 24 hours, 48 hours. IT's upset, right? They're getting pounded on. Sales is trying to and ops are trying to just push things through as fast as they can to get things back up and running. The entire company is really in recovery mode at this point. And I was in the offices, and it was, at that point, I think it was like Saturday morning, and it was like 7 o'clock in the morning, and there's just people running around, like a full business day, Monday or Tuesday, everybody's carrying laptops down the halls. They're going back and forth. They're trying to figure out, how can they get work done without, in some cases, being able to log in other cases, definitely without being able to get on the network. People using, their phones as tethering devices so they can still get to the internet to try to get some data where they needed it and to try to communicate with customers. And the workload and stress is just massive at this point. And then we kind of come into the next step, right? So again, day 2 now, 8 o'clock at night. The CFO was kind of working throughout the day with his team and started wanting to figure out, what's our real cost here? What kind of costs are we incurring? And the one thing I want to point out is when I had my team working on this in marketing, they actually made a mistake, probably because they couldn't even fathom it, that these should say hour and not day. These numbers. So if you think about it, yeah, per hour. So you've got 12,000 field employees, right? Assume they are highly skilled, so they're paid fairly well around the world. They're not working generally. They're not able to get to jobs. They're finishing jobs potentially in some cases. You've got another 8,000 to 9,000 non-field employees. They're not getting work done. Just divide by 2,080 hours in a year, an hourly rate, 24-hour shifts in some cases, and that number is just the cost that you're paying in payroll. That doesn't count what your margin is on the work that somebody should be doing, where this happened to be a service organization that got paid on people's time, on the hours that are supposed to be coming in because you're able to bill your customers. So you're not even getting that, so it's a number much bigger than this. So literally, millions a day, millions. Realizing this, right, at this point, this is when, legal gets called. So for the lawyers here, I heard the lawyers are called, and we always recommend that, right? Engage your outside counsel as fast as you can when these things happen, because you're going to want to get their advice, because everything you do has an impact on insurance, has an impact on any kind of litigation that comes out of it with customers and vendors. And you also want to get your org that's working on your breach, if possible, into attorney-client privilege, so that anything we find, we can talk with you about it. We're not going to talk to anyone else. We won't be compelled to talk to anyone else, at that point. So, and another important thing that happens, and when you see that happening in a breach, you kind of know that, things have gone sideways. And then, next is the company's CEO, right? So he's obviously considering that hourly cost at that point of the downtime. But not simply that now for the CEO, right? The CEO is also thinking about, this. What about our reputation with clients? Like, what are our clients thinking right now? We're not getting their work done, across the world. The trickle impact of this down on other companies and other people that rely on this organization every day, it starts to be pretty overwhelming when you start thinking about it. And then in this case, a family business that started, almost 100 years ago, became a public company, survived through wars and, all kinds of things that happened over those 100 years. Foreign competition, the advent of computers and technology, which actually changed so many businesses. They adapted and adjusted. Yet this event was something that, he couldn't think of his father, anyone ever talking about and telling him something that had debilitated, their business so much that they couldn't run. Now, granted, they're a lot bigger, but ultimately what kind of stuck with me was the fact that I sat at a table with this team and his team, and this is a person who personally is a billionaire, not really probably worried about himself from a financial perspective, but definitely worried about his legacy, his business, hand in head, literally trying to figure out, how did this happen to me with, these, and it was like, I remember saying something like, these computers, I don't understand how this has, we've gotten this wound up in this to tear us down. On top of that, now he needs to reassure his clients, right? That's the first step. He's got to talk to all these clients, let them know, hey, we're solving this problem, even though, the team is still struggling behind the scenes, right, with the problem. He's got to reassure his employees. Can't have them going out and sort of worried and, running down the hall screaming, the hair's on fire. And he's got to reassure himself. Am I doing all the right things? So counsel, with us, with other third parties, with people that have been trusted over the years. Brought in his big five at that point. Firm is in now, fully engaged in the conversation. And I think that what was interesting was that executives and IT and CISOs that have been interviewed after a breach like this have come back, 90% of them come back and said it resulted in more budget for cybersecurity, right? No surprise. And when you think about the dollars that really are on the table and the amount of cost that happens when one of these incidents takes place, it's not a surprise. And the budget really shouldn't be something that people think about. So when I tell this story a lot of times, especially to business owners, having owned a business myself, sold 2 businesses, been in cybersecurity for a long time, I can kind of think of myself on the other side of that table while the meter's running and you're trying to figure out, what am I going to say to my bank? What am I going to say to, my customers after the fact? It was very compelling. And then, sort of what are the things that you would do next, right? So, think about, the issues and the vulnerabilities, of the business and the risks every time you automate something, right? I don't think people always think about that. They've got a process. It may be a manual process. Automation is great. We speed things up. We get them done. But have we really thought about how will we unwind this? What's the impact of this technology from a security perspective and from an operational perspective if it doesn't work? And we've now have 12,000 people relying on it to get their work done every day. And I think there's a lot of systems out there like that if they're offline, companies are not able to function. And then, what about those incident response plans? I asked the question, and a lot of clients that I talk to, I don't think they actually take them seriously enough. I mean, do you red team? Do you purple team? Meaning, having your team sort of work with the attacker to kind of find out based on the techniques, how do we avoid this from happening? How do we keep somebody out of our system? Do we do mock exercises on, what happens when we can't access systems? And really involving, it's really hard too, by the way, to convince sales or convince somebody in accounting that, your life is really going to be miserable if we go down. You can't just point at IT now. You're going to be up all night just like we are. And you're not going to be able to get work done, and we might not be able to, make a payroll at some point. And then, being able to think very strategically, right, about the legal and insurance things, business interruption insurance. Are these things really in place? What's the sort of fine print around them? And have you guys tested those as well to make sure the policies fit still the risk that's there? So when I said business risk before, yeah, you're right. It's a hard thing to quantify. But business risks really are, prioritized by what are your critical things in your business that you can't operate without, right? It's sort of defining some of those risks and then applying cybersecurity controls and cost against them. Sometimes, a risk is $10,000 and the control is $100,000 and you're not going to do that. But most of the time, you find out it's kind of scenarios like we're talking about today. And, last but not least, these guys spend, and this was something I talked to the CISO about afterwards, who was a fairly technical guy. We spent 48 to 72 hours chasing our tails. Because this was a nation state quality. I won't say it was necessarily. We don't necessarily do attribution at Cylance. We know who it was. We figured out who it was pretty quickly. We worked with federal authorities in the U.S. and sort of validated that. We knew who the group was. We knew the group had done this before. We knew the group had a reputation for making money from ransomware claims this way. But they literally were playing a game of whack-a-mole, as they moved around the environment, trying to get systems clean, trying to get systems back online, trying to create an enclave of a network that was separate from the network where the attackers had access. And it was only, when somebody talked a little bit, and our solution was one of the pieces that was used with some other things, but when we got a tool with a math model with AI on the actual endpoint, that we actually kind of had a chance, right, to do containment. Not necessarily to clean it or stop it at that point, but just to literally contain and to move faster than the attackers were moving. Because once you have somebody that can make human decisions, you've got to have some kind of a tool that doesn't require a signature or a heuristic at that point. And so for us, the one value that we've had in these breaches is the ability to contain, and contain very quickly. So we came in, I think, about 48 hours in, and again, back to your insurances, they actually were running a pilot with us at that time and hadn't deployed yet fully. And then when they brought us in the first hour, which I had gotten the calls and all, about 8 hours in, we had to pull back because the insurance company said, well, Cylance isn't on your list. Here's the guys you need to use. So they brought in some other guys who were good, by the way. We ended up working with them all brilliant technical guys. If my team had been there without the tool, we couldn't have stopped it either. So literally, 48 hours later, and if you want to do the math, I think around 45 million or so later burned. We came back in, and about 12 hours after that, we were able to get the agent deployed and get containment. They weren't out yet, but we were able to stop them from infecting and putting new ransomware on machines. And I'm a technical guy. I wrote code in the past. I also won't say that nothing is 100%. Given enough time in the system, sure, these guys probably could have found a way to get around our system once they knew what it was they were working on too. It's very hard. We try it all the time. We have red teams that attack our own product, but we could have been 72, 96 hours down the road back in the same situation if we didn't work then to quickly get them out of the system and know who they were. And I think certain things though about that, it leads me back to a word kind of called prevention. Like, how can you really prevent these attacks? Like, there's nothing ultimately that you can do to 100% prevent the attacks. But I think that the industry has unfortunately fallen victim to this a little bit, in my mind, which is I don't think anywhere that you go, you'll hear somebody that necessarily disagrees with this, but using this as a reason not to try to prevent attacks before they happen is just something that you wouldn't do. I mean, the fire brigade's not going to say, well, place is going to burn down, so sometimes we're just going to let them burn. We're not going to work as hard, right? So I always like to keep that in front of everybody, because what happens is this gets in front of the CEOs. It's not the technical guys. We all know that this is true, but that when the CEO hears it and the business people hear it, they think, well, it's just the way it is. It's okay. We don't have to spend all that money. We don't have to invest in these things because you can't stop them. And that's not true. You actually can stop the majority of these attacks with basic good hygiene, frankly. Operational changes to the way you do things, and leveraging, the right tool set. This one drove me crazy too. I don't know how many people were at RSA, but sort of the same scenario, right? Someone's up on stage and it's like 1% improvements, get a little bit better every day. Then this one, if a vulnerability is found in the wild, let's patch it. Well, that's kind of defeated. I mean, somebody's got to die before we fix it, right? AI, machine learning, whether it's us or somebody else, you actually have a chance to stop that before it hits. We don't want to patch. We actually want to stop things before they happen if we can. And that's kind of been our focus. And then last but not least, I think this plays right into it, right? Back to that first one. The greatest danger is to aim, too high and miss it versus aiming too low and then we reach it, right? So, I mean, to me, people should be aiming to stop and to prevent. You shouldn't be trying to say it's okay, we're going to get breached. So, when I go back to that story and I think about that CEO and I think about all the dollars and all the kind of pain and burn, I realize that, we've been through tens and 20 of these attacks just in the last year at this level. And so we get a little bit immune to it. But sitting in there, watching these guys from the exec level, the CFO, the COO, deal with the stress, the pain, literally his business that was started by his family. You know, these are real things. They really do impact. And if you haven't been through this, I'd suggest, you know, reading more stories like this, finding about it. Take time to tell a story to one of your execs, teach your execs to tell these stories in board meetings if they're willing. Shorter versions of them, but this will happen to somebody in this room, unfortunately. And hopefully it's not as painful, as bad as this. But thanks, and happy to answer your questions, you know, anytime. Appreciate it. Yeah.